The train whistle pierced the autumn air as Zachary Jacobson stood on the wooden platform of Ordway, Colorado, his weathered hands anxiously gripping the brim of his hat. The year was 1882, and the westward expansion had transformed this once quiet mining settlement into a bustling frontier town. At 32, Hank Newman had finally saved enough from his cattle ranch to send for a bride from back east, but nothing had prepared him for the woman who stepped off the train. Zelda Jameson descended shakily from the passenger car, her porcelain skin nearly translucent in the harsh mountain sunlight. Even from a distance, Hank could see she was beautiful, delicate features framed by auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, but it was the handkerchief pressed to her lips and the hollow cough that followed that made his heart sink. As their eyes met across the platform, he knew immediately what ailed her: consumption, the white plague, the same disease that had taken his mother years before. "Mr. Newman." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying a slight southern lilt as she approached. "I'm Zelda Jameson. Your bride, if you'll still have me." Another cough racked her slender frame, and Hank moved forward instinctively to steady her. "Miss Jameson." He tipped his hat, suddenly aware of his calloused hands and sun-weathered face. "Welcome to Ordway. Let me help you with your things." "I should have written about my condition," she said, her green eyes meeting his directly. "The doctor in Richmond gave me 6 months, perhaps a year. I'll understand if you wish to nullify our arrangement." Hank studied her face, the flush of fever on her cheeks, the determined set of her jaw despite the obvious exhaustion of her journey. Something stirred in him, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "The West has cured many ailments," he said, lifting her single trunk effortlessly. "And a promise is a promise, Miss Jameson. I sent for a bride, and here you are." "You needn't feel obligated," she insisted, another cough punctuating her words. Hank shook his head. "I'm a man of my word, Miss Jameson. For whatever time you have left, be it months or years, I intend to make it worth living." As he helped her into his wagon, her delicate hand in his, Hank knew his life had changed irrevocably. What he couldn't know was how deeply that change would reach into his soul. The journey to Hank's ranch took nearly 2 hours, and Zelda fought to keep her eyes open despite the fatigue that threatened to overwhelm her. The landscape unfolded before her like nothing she had ever seen: endless expanses of golden prairie grass giving way to distant purple mountains. Occasionally, Hank would point out landmarks: a creek where he watered his cattle, a ridge where mountain lions sometimes prowled, the distant smoke from a neighboring ranch 10 miles away. "It's beautiful," she managed between coughing fits. "So much space." "In Richmond, houses sit right against one another," Hank nodded. "Too much space sometimes. Gets awful quiet when winter comes." "Is that why you sent for a bride?" Zelda asked, curiosity temporarily overcoming her exhaustion. A faint blush colored Hank's weathered cheeks. "Partly. Ranch needs a woman's touch, and a man gets to thinkin' too much when he's alone." He paused, then added more softly, "Didn't expect to be bringing home a sick woman, though." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I truly thought the air out west might help me recover. That's what the doctors said anyway." "I should have been honest with you." Hank's hands tightened on the reins. "My mother had consumption. I was 14 when she passed. I know what's ahead." "And still you'll have me, a dying woman. We're all dying, Miss Jameson. Some just have a better idea of when." He turned to her, his blue eyes intent. "I aim to give you a home for as long as you need one. That was our arrangement, and I stand by it." Zelda felt tears threatening and blinked them away. She had prepared herself for rejection, had steeled herself for the possibility of being turned away at the station. Instead, this quiet, solemn man was offering her dignity in her final months. As the wagon crested a hill, Hank's ranch came into view. A sturdy two-story cabin built of weathered pine logs stood proudly against the backdrop of distant mountains. A barn and several outbuildings clustered nearby, and a corral held several horses that lifted their heads at their approach. It wasn't grand, but to Zelda's eyes, it was a kingdom. "Welcome to the Lazy Inn," Hank said, a hint of pride in his voice. "It ain't much, but it's mine, every nail and board." "It's magnificent," she replied honestly. He helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands gentle at her waist, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the yard, two strangers bound by an agreement neither had expected to unfold this way. "I had Doc Wilson prepare the bedroom for you," Hank said, leading her toward the house. "Thought you might want to rest after your journey." "Doc Wilson knows about me?" Zelda asked, suddenly self-conscious. Hank nodded. "Sent a boy to fetch him while I was waiting for your train. Thought he should take a look at you, see if there's anything to be done." He paused at the door. "Hope that's all right." Zelda nodded, grateful for his foresight. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, its mantel adorned with a few books and a carved wooden horse. Braided rugs covered portions of the plank floor, and sturdy furniture a table with 4 chairs, a sofa covered in faded quilts, and a rocking chair near the hearth made the space feel homely despite its obvious bachelor occupancy. "Your room's upstairs," Hank said, carrying her trunk. "I'll be sleeping in the lean-to off the kitchen for now." "I can't take your bed," Zelda protested. "You ain't taking it. I'm giving it to you." His tone brooked no argument. The upstairs bedroom was simple but clean, with a large feather bed covered in a patchwork quilt. A washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher stood in one corner, and a chest of drawers in another. The window overlooked the valley, and Zelda could see cattle grazing in the distance. "It's perfect," she said, sinking gratefully onto the edge of the bed. "Thank you, Mr. Newman." "Hank," he corrected. "We're to be married, after all." The reminder of their arrangement hung in the air between them. Zelda hadn't expected him to honor it, given her condition. "About that," she began hesitantly. "I understand if you'd prefer to wait, or even if you've changed your mind entirely." Hank leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "I sent for a bride because I need a partner, Miss Jameson, someone to share my life with, however long that might be. The preacher comes through town every 3rd Sunday. If you're willing, we can be married then." "But why?" Zelda pressed. "I'll bring you nothing but care and eventual grief." "Maybe I think you're worth it," he replied simply. "Rest now, I'll bring up some tea." As he left the room, Zelda found herself staring after him, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place and this man. She had come west seeking a husband and perhaps a miracle cure for her illness. She had found the former, but as another coughing spell seized her, she wondered bitterly if the latter would prove elusive. Dr. Wilson arrived the following morning, his buggy raising dust on the road well before Zelda had risen. She heard voices below and hastily dressed, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her high-necked blouse. By the time she descended the stairs, Hank and the doctor were seated at the kitchen table, mugs of coffee before them. "Ah, the patient arrives," Dr. Wilson said, rising. He was an older man with kind eyes and a well-trimmed silver beard. "I'm Benjamin Wilson. Hank here tells me you've traveled all the way from Virginia." "Richmond," Zelda confirmed, accepting Hank's silent offer of the chair he vacated. "The doctors there suggested the mountain air might improve my condition." "A common prescription," Dr. Wilson nodded. "And not without merit, though no miracle cure, I'm afraid." He gestured toward the sitting room. "Shall we conduct an examination? I've asked Hank to prepare a private space." For the next half hour, Dr. Wilson listened to Zelda's lungs, checked her pulse, and asked detailed questions about her symptoms and their progression. His expression remained professionally neutral, but Zelda had seen enough physicians to recognize the grave concern in his eyes. "The journey has weakened you," he said finally, helping her button her blouse. "You need rest, good food, and fresh air. I can give you something for the cough, but—" He hesitated. "I know what consumption means, doctor," Zelda said quietly. "How long would you estimate?" Dr. Wilson sighed. "It's advanced, but not as severely as some cases I've seen. With proper care, you might have a year, perhaps a bit more. The mountain air may indeed help, though it's no cure." Zelda nodded, having expected as much. "Thank you for your honesty." When they rejoined Hank in the kitchen, the doctor provided similar information. Hank listened silently, his face impassive, but Zelda noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped his coffee mug. "I'll leave these powders for the cough," Dr. Wilson said, placing a package on the table. "Mix with warm water morning and night. I'll return next week to check on you. Meanwhile, rest as much as possible." After the doctor left, Hank busied himself at the stove, his back to Zelda. "Hungry?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "A little," she admitted. "Mr. Newman, Hank, I understand if this changes things." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Does a year seem too short to you, Miss Jameson?" "For what?" "For living." He set a plate of eggs and bacon before her. "A year is time enough for seasons to change, for crops to grow, for memories to be made." He hesitated, then continued more softly. "I still aim to marry you come Sunday if you'll have me." Zelda stared at him, bewildered by his steadfastness. "Why would you tie yourself to a dying woman?" Hank sat across from her, his calloused hands flat on the table. "When I sent for a bride, I wasn't looking for just anyone. I wanted someone brave enough to leave everything behind and start fresh in unknown territory." His blue eyes held hers. "Seems to me you've proven your courage already, traveling all this way despite your condition. That's the kind of partner I want, for however long we have." Tears pricked at Zelda's eyes. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "The rest we'll learn together." And so it was decided. That night, Zelda wrote a letter to her aunt in Richmond, the only family she had left, explaining her situation and her decision to marry Hank despite her illness. As she sealed the envelope, she realized she felt more peace than she had since her diagnosis months earlier. For the first time, she was looking forward rather than counting down. The days before their wedding passed in a gentle rhythm. Zelda's strength gradually returned with rest and regular meals. Hank proved to be a surprisingly good cook, though he admitted he'd had to learn out of necessity. Each morning, he brought her tea before heading out to tend the cattle, and each evening they sat by the fire, slowly getting to know each other through conversation that grew increasingly comfortable. She learned he had come west at 18, working as a ranch hand until he saved enough to claim his own land. He'd built the cabin himself, adding onto it each year as his herd grew. He spoke little of his family back east, only that his father had remarried after his mother's death, creating a rift that never healed. In turn, Zelda shared stories of her life in Richmond, the loss of her parents to influenza 5 years earlier, and her work as a seamstress in her aunt's shop afterward. She didn't mention the young doctor who had courted her before her diagnosis and disappeared shortly after. Nor did she speak of the lonely months of contemplating her mortality before answering Hank's advertisement for a bride. On the third Sunday after her arrival, Reverend Taylor conducted their wedding in the front room of the cabin. The only witnesses were Dr. Wilson and Martha Calloway, the wife of Hank's nearest neighbor, who had brought a small cake and helped Zelda dress for the occasion. "You make a beautiful bride," Martha had whispered, pinning a sprig of dried lavender to Zelda's best dress, a modest blue affair that complemented her auburn hair and green eyes. "Even with death as my dowry," Zelda had replied, attempting humor to mask her nervousness. Martha's kind eyes had grown serious. "Hank Newman is no fool, dear. If he's chosen you, it's because he sees something worth cherishing, however brief the time." The ceremony itself was simple and solemn. Hank had shaved carefully and wore a clean white shirt beneath his best coat. When they exchanged vows, his voice was steady, his eyes never leaving hers. Zelda was struck by the gravity with which he promised to love and honor her all the days of our lives, knowing those days were numbered. After their guests departed, an awkward silence fell between them. They were husband and wife now, yet the circumstances of their union were far from conventional. "I had a room prepared for you downstairs," Hank said finally, sensing her unease. "I'll continue sleeping in the lean-to until I'm gone." Zelda finished for him, surprising herself with her directness. Hank's expression softened. "Until you're ready for more than just a name and a roof, Zelda. I meant what I said today. You're my wife now, but I don't expect anything you're not willing to give." The tension eased from her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." That night, in her new room off the kitchen, far more convenient than climbing the stairs several times daily, Zelda reflected on the strange path her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been preparing to die alone in Richmond. Now she was married to a kind stranger in the Colorado wilderness, with no certainty of tomorrow but a curious peace about today. As October gave way to November, Zelda gradually found her place in the rhythm of ranch life. Though her strength was limited, she insisted on contributing where she could. She took over the cooking, discovering to her delight that Hank appreciated her southern recipes, particularly her biscuits and gravy. She began mending his clothes, appalled at the state of his shirts and trousers, and even started a small indoor herb garden on the kitchen windowsill. On days when her cough was less severe, she would sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching Hank work with the horses or mend fences. Sometimes he would look up, as if sensing her gaze, and touch the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. These simple moments filled her with an unexpected contentment. One clear, cold morning, Hank appeared at breakfast with an unusual proposition. "Thought you might like to see more of the ranch today," he said casually, "if you're feeling up to it." Zelda glanced out the window at the frost-covered ground. "It's quite cold." "Got plenty of blankets," Hank replied, "and I've fixed up the wagon special. Be good for you to get some air that isn't just the porch." Curiosity piqued. Zelda agreed, and after breakfast found Hank had indeed transformed the wagon, lining the bed with straw and quilts and rigging a sort of canopy to block the wind. He helped her up, tucking blankets around her with surprising tenderness, then climbed up beside her. "First stop, the North Pasture," he announced, flicking the reins. For the next several hours, Hank gave her a tour of his domain. He showed her the creek that never froze, even in the deepest winter, the stand of pine trees where he cut wood for their fire, the high meadow where wildflowers bloomed in such profusion during spring that it looks like God spilled a paint box. He spoke more that day than Zelda had heard in their entire acquaintance, his quiet pride in his land evident in every word. As the sun reached its zenith, he stopped at a sheltered spot overlooking a small valley. From a pack behind the seat, he produced a modest picnic bread, cheese, dried apples, and a jar of honey. "Not exactly a Richmond tea party," he said with a rare smile. "It's perfect," Zelda replied, meaning it. They ate in companionable silence, the vast Colorado sky a brilliant blue above them. Despite the lingering chill, Zelda felt warmer than she had in months. "Thank you for today," she said as they finished their meal. For showing me your world." Hank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Wanted you to see it, to understand why I love it here." He paused, choosing his words with care. "When I sent for a bride, I wasn't just looking for someone to cook and clean. I wanted someone to share this with." He gestured at the panorama before them. "Even if it's just for a little while." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the peculiar intimacy they had developed despite the unusual circumstances of their marriage. "Hank," Zelda began hesitantly, "may I ask you something personal?" He nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Why did you really agree to marry me, knowing I was ill? The truth." Hank was silent for so long that Zelda thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "My mother suffered for 3 years before consumption took her. By the end, my father couldn't bear to look at her, just left her care to me and my sister. She died alone while he was in town drinking." His jaw tightened at the memory. "No one should die alone, Zelda, not if someone can be there to hold their hand." Tears pricked at her eyes. "So it's pity?" "No," he said firmly, turning to face her. "It's humanity. And maybe something more, though I can't rightly name it yet." He reached out tentatively, his weathered fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're easy to care for, Zelda Newman." The use of her married name sent an unexpected warmth through her. On impulse, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. His skin was warm despite the cold air, and she caught the scent of pine and leather that she had come to associate with him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me as more than my illness." The moment hung between them, fragile and new. Then Hank cleared his throat and began gathering their picnic things. "Better head back before the sun starts dropping. Gets cold quick out here." As they made their way home, Zelda found herself studying her husband's profile against the setting sun. For the first time since her diagnosis, she felt a dangerous emotion stirring within her. Hope. Not for a cure, she was too pragmatic for that, but for meaning in whatever time remained to her. Winter descended on the Colorado high country with a vengeance. By mid-December, snow blanketed the landscape, transforming the ranch into a gleaming white kingdom. The cattle huddled in sheltered areas, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Hank worked from sunrise to sunset, ensuring the animals had food and unfrozen water, often returning to the cabin with ice in his beard and exhaustion lining his face. Despite Dr. Wilson's predictions, Zelda's condition stabilized somewhat. The harsh, racking cough still came, especially in the mornings, but the mountain air seemed to ease her breathing during the day. She found she could manage small tasks around the cabin without becoming completely exhausted cooking, mending, even some light cleaning. These small victories felt enormous after months of decline. As Christmas approached, Zelda secretly worked on gifts for Hank whenever he was out of the house. From scraps of fabric, she fashioned new handkerchiefs, embroidering his initials in one corner. From one of his old shirts, too worn to mend properly, she crafted a quilted pot holder to replace the singed rag he currently used. And from her own treasured possessions, she selected a small leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poetry that had belonged to her father, inscribing a simple message on the flyleaf. On Christmas Eve, a blizzard howled around the cabin, the wind finding every crack and crevice in the solid log walls. Hank had spent the day securing the livestock and bringing in extra firewood. By evening, he had built up the fire to a roaring blaze that filled the main room with warmth and flickering light. To Zelda's surprise, he produced a small pine tree which he set in a bucket of sand in one corner of the room. "Not much for decorating," he admitted, "but seemed like Christmas ought to have a tree." "It's lovely," Zelda said, genuinely touched. "I have some red ribbon we could use, and perhaps some dried berries from the kitchen. Together, they adorned the little tree, Zelda directing from her chair by the fire while Hank followed her instructions with good-natured patience. When they finished, he disappeared briefly to the lean-to, returning with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Got something for you," he said gruffly, handing it to her. "Not much, but—" Zelda unwrapped the package carefully to find a beautiful hand-carved wooden comb, its teeth smooth and perfect, the handle decorated with delicate flower patterns. "Hank, it's exquisite," she breathed, running her fingers over the polished wood. He shrugged, embarrassed by her praise. "Been working on it evenings. Thought it might look nice in your hair." Impulsively, Zelda removed the pins from her auburn tresses, letting them fall around her shoulders. She passed the comb through her hair, marveling at how smoothly it glided. "How does it look?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious under his intense gaze. "Beautiful," he said softly. "You're beautiful, Zelda." A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her. Rising from her chair, she retrieved her own gifts from their hiding place in the kitchen cupboard. "I have something for you too," she said, presenting the bundle with nervous hands. "Nothing as fine as your gift, I'm afraid." Hank opened each item carefully, his expression growing more tender with each revealed treasure. When he came to the book, he traced the embossed cover with reverent fingers. "Nobody's given me a book before," he said, opening it to read her inscription. "To Hank, who saw value in damaged goods. With gratitude, your wife, Zelda." His eyes, when they met hers, held a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "You've never been damaged goods to me, Zelda." "Then what have I been?" He set the gifts aside and rose, crossing to where she stood by the fire. Slowly, giving her every chance to retreat, he raised one hand to cup her cheek. "A blessing I never expected." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. Zelda found herself responding, her hands coming to rest on his chest, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath his woolen shirt. When they parted, both were breathing as if they'd run a great distance. "I didn't think." Zelda began, then stopped, unsure how to express the confusion of emotions flooding through her. "Nor did I," Hank admitted. "But here we are." That night, they shared a bed for the first time since their wedding, though nothing more than gentle embraces and whispered conversations passed between them. As Zelda drifted to sleep in the circle of her husband's arms, she realized that for the first time in nearly a year, she had gone a full day without thinking about dying. January brought the coldest weather in recent memory, according to the old-timers in Ordway. The temperature dropped so low that the mercury in thermometers retreated into its bulb, and even the hardy cattle required extra attention to survive the brutal conditions. Hank spent hours each day breaking ice on water troughs and distributing hay, returning to the cabin with frost-nipped cheeks and fingers nearly too stiff to unbutton his coat. Despite the harsh weather, Zelda's health continued its surprising stability. Her cough remained, especially in the mornings, but the hemorrhaging that had terrified her in Richmond occurred less frequently. Dr. Wilson, visiting during a brief thaw, expressed cautious optimism. "The disease hasn't advanced as I expected," he admitted, putting away his stethoscope. "I won't raise false hopes. Consumption is consumption, but you've found a good balance here. Rest when needed, fresh air when possible, and clearly," he added with a meaningful glance at Hank, "a reason to fight." The gradual change in their relationship continued to unfold like a delicate flower opening toward the sun. They were still learning each other, still navigating the strange circumstances that had brought them together, but the awkwardness between them had largely dissolved. Hank no longer hesitated to take her hand or kiss her cheek, and Zelda found herself watching for his return each day with increasing anticipation. One evening in late January, as they sat before the fire after supper, Zelda brought up a subject that had been on her mind for weeks. "I'd like to write to my aunt about coming to visit in the spring," she said, her hands busy with mending one of Hank's shirts. "If my health permits, of course." Hank looked up from the bridle he was repairing. "Of course. Be good for you to see family." Zelda nodded, then continued more hesitantly. "I've also been thinking. Perhaps we could visit the town more regularly when the weather improves. I'd like to meet more of your neighbors, maybe attend church services." "You sure you're up to all that?" Hank asked, concern evident in his voice. "I won't know unless I try," Zelda replied. "And I'm tired of living as if each day might be my last. I want to build something here, Hank, even if it's just relationships that might comfort you after." Hank set aside his work and moved to kneel before her chair. "Don't talk like that," he said, taking her hands in his. "Each day is a gift, yes, but let's not borrow trouble from tomorrow." Zelda met his gaze steadily. "It's not borrowing trouble to acknowledge reality, Hank. I'm feeling better than I expected, but we both know this disease doesn't release its victims once it takes hold." "Maybe not," he conceded. "But I've seen you get stronger these past months, not weaker. And Doc Wilson says—" "Dr. Wilson is being kind," Zelda interrupted gently. "But I don't need kindness right now. I need honesty between us." She squeezed his hands. "I want to live as fully as possible with whatever time I have. That means making plans, meeting people, being your true wife in every sense." A flush crept up Hank's neck at her last words. Since Christmas Eve, they had shared a bed but nothing more, both hesitant to cross that final boundary given her fragile health. "Zelda," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "you don't need to prove anything to me." "It's not about proving anything," she replied softly. "It's about living, truly living while I still can." She raised one hand to his cheek. "I'm not made of glass, Hank, and I find I've grown to care for you deeply." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Hank turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss to her skin. "I love you," he said simply. "Didn't expect to, didn't plan to, but there it is." The words struck Zelda like a physical blow, momentarily robbing her of breath. No one had said those words to her since her diagnosis, as if love and terminal illness were incompatible states. "You can't," she whispered, even as her heart leaped at his declaration. "I can," he corrected gently. "And I do. Whether we have months or years doesn't change that." When he kissed her then, it was different from their previous cautious embraces, deeper, more certain, a promise rather than a question. Zelda responded with an intensity that surprised them both, her hands tangling in his hair, drawing him closer. Later that night, their relationship crossed the final threshold from arrangement to true marriage. Hank was infinitely gentle, treating her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, lying in the quiet darkness with her head on his chest, Zelda felt a peace she had never expected to find again. "I love you too," she whispered, the words both a gift and a small tragedy. Hank's arms tightened around her. "Then we'll make the most of every day we're given." As February melted into March, the first subtle signs of spring appeared on the ranch. Snow still blanketed much of the ground, but the sun gained strength daily, creating patches of bare earth around rocks and trees. Tiny buds appeared on the aspen trees, and one morning Zelda spotted a robin hopping across a patch of exposed grass. With the milder weather came renewed energy. On her better days, Zelda ventured outside more frequently, supervising the planting of a small vegetable garden beside the house and helping Hank with lighter chores around the ranch. Her cough persisted, but the mountain air seemed to soothe her lungs, allowing her more active hours than she had enjoyed in Richmond. True to her word, Zelda had written to her aunt, Elizabeth, inviting her to visit in the summer. The reply had arrived with the mail coach, a joyful acceptance along with news from Richmond and a packet of seeds for Zelda's garden. The letter had also contained a veiled inquiry about her health, to which Zelda responded with careful optimism in her next letter. As promised, Hank began taking her into Ordway more regularly. Their first Sunday at the small wooden church caused a stir among the congregants, many of whom had heard about Hank's mail-order bride but few of whom had actually met her. To Zelda's relief, the community welcomed her warmly, particularly the women, who seemed delighted to have a new member in their circle. Martha Calloway, the neighbor who had assisted at their wedding, proved especially kind, introducing Zelda to the other ranchers' wives and including her in their quilting circle, which met monthly in different homes throughout the area. "You've brought Hank Newman out of his shell," Martha confided during one such gathering at the Calloway Ranch. "Never seen him so sociable as he's been since you arrived." "He's a good man," Zelda replied, carefully stitching a square for the community quilt they were making. Martha's perceptive eyes studied her face. "And you love him," she observed. "Despite everything." Zelda nodded, unable to deny the truth. "I never expected to find love here, especially under the circumstances." "Love has a way of finding us when we least expect it," Martha said, patting Zelda's hand. "My Henry and I have been married 28 years come May, and I still find him surprising me." Her expression grew more serious. "How are you really doing, dear?" "Your color looks better than when I first met you." "I have good days and bad," Zelda admitted. "The good ones seem to be outnumbering the bad lately, though Dr. Wilson cautions me not to become too optimistic." "Doctors know a great deal," Martha replied, "but they don't know everything. I've seen people given death sentences by physicians who went on to outlive the very doctors who pronounced them." Zelda smiled at the older woman's encouragement, though she was careful not to nurture false hope. She had made her peace with her condition, focusing instead on filling whatever time remained with meaningful experiences. April arrived with its characteristic unpredictability, balmy days followed by sudden snowstorms, brilliant sunshine giving way to slashing rain. The garden Zelda had planted began showing tentative green sprouts, which she protected from late frosts with old sheets and burlap sacks. Inside the cabin, she continued making small improvements: curtains for the windows, a braided rug beside their bed, wildflowers in mason jars on the table. On one particularly fine day, Hank surprised her by saddling 2 horses after breakfast. "Thought you might like to see the high meadow," he said, leading a gentle mare to the mounting block he had constructed for her. "Wildflowers are just starting to bloom. Are you sure I can manage it?" Zelda asked, eyeing the horse nervously. She had ridden occasionally in Richmond but never in the rugged terrain of Colorado. "Daisy here is steady as they come," Hank assured her, "and we'll take it slow, but if you'd rather not—" "No, I want to," Zelda said quickly. The prospect of seeing the meadow Hank had described so lovingly during their winter conversations outweighed her apprehension. With Hank's assistance, she mounted the placid mare, arranging her split riding skirt, another of her sewing projects, modestly over her legs. Hank swung easily onto his own horse, a tall bay gelding, and led the way from the ranch yard. The ride took them through stands of aspen trees, their new leaves shimmering like coins in the breeze, and across shallow streams swollen with snowmelt. Zelda's initial nervousness gave way to exhilaration as she and Daisy found their rhythm together. Hank remained close, his eyes constantly checking on her, but he seemed pleased by her growing confidence. After about an hour of leisurely riding, they emerged from a pine forest onto the high meadow Hank had described. Zelda gasped at the sight. Early spring wildflowers carpeted the gently rolling field, purple lupine, yellow glacier lilies, and tiny white spring beauties creating a natural tapestry against the green grass. Beyond, the snow-capped mountains rose majestically against the impossibly blue sky. "Oh, Hank," she breathed, reining Daisy to a halt beside his horse. "It's even more beautiful than you described." Hank smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thought you'd appreciate it. Worth the ride." "Worth every minute," she assured him, drinking in the panoramic vista. They dismounted near a small stream that bisected the meadow, letting the horses graze while they spread a blanket on a sunny patch of grass. Hank had packed a simple lunch: bread, cheese, dried venison, and apples which they shared as clouds drifted lazily overhead. "I used to come here when I first claimed the land," Hank said, leaning back on his elbows. "Would camp for days sometimes, just listening to the wind and watching the stars. Helped me think." "What did you think about?" Zelda asked, curious about this glimpse into his past. "The future, mostly." "What I wanted to build, who I wanted to become." He glanced at her. "Never imagined I'd be sharing it with someone like you, though." "Someone sickly, you mean?" she said lightly, though the question held weight. Hank shook his head. "Someone refined, educated. You know your letters better than most men around here, let alone women. You've read books I've never heard of. Sometimes I wonder what you're doing with a rough cowboy who can barely sign his name." Zelda reached for his hand, surprised by this revelation of insecurity. "You're the most honorable man I've ever known, Hank Newman. Books and fancy education don't compare to that." He squeezed her fingers, his expression serious. "Been thinking about learning better. Maybe you could teach me. More reading, proper writing." "I'd be honored," she said sincerely. They lingered in the meadow until mid-afternoon, when Zelda's energy began to wane and a telltale cough reminded them of the limitations they lived with. The ride home was slower, Hank solicitous of her comfort, but Zelda felt a deep satisfaction despite her fatigue. She had seen the high meadow in its spring glory, something she had feared might never happen during the long winter months. That night, after a simple supper, Zelda took down one of the few books they had in the house, a well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, and began Hank's first reading lesson. His progress was slow but steady, his determination evident in the way he concentrated on each word, sounding out the letters just as a child might. Zelda was a patient teacher, praising his successes and gently correcting his mistakes. "You're doing wonderfully," she encouraged as they finished for the evening. "You already know more than you realize." Hank closed the book carefully. "Had a teacher tell me once I was too stupid to learn properly. Believed him for a long time." Anger flared in Zelda at the thought of someone crushing a child's confidence so callously. "Well, he was wrong," she said firmly. "You're not stupid, Hank. You built this ranch from nothing. You manage cattle and crops and finances. That takes intelligence." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Like how you stand up for me." "Someone should," she replied. "And that's what wives do, isn't it? Stand by their husbands." "Suppose so," he agreed, pulling her gently into his arms, "just as husbands stand by their wives through whatever comes." The reminder of his promise to love her for whatever time remained hung in the air between them, but it no longer carried the same weight of sadness. Instead, it felt like an affirmation of the bond they had forged, unexpected and precious. May brought a riot of color to the ranch. The garden flourished under Zelda's care, producing tender lettuce, radishes, and early peas. Wildflowers bloomed in profusion along the creek and in the pastures. Even the cabin seemed brighter, with windows thrown open to catch the spring breezes and vases of fresh flowers on every available surface. Zelda's health continued its surprising stability. While the cough persisted, especially in the mornings, she found her strength and stamina gradually increasing. Dr. Wilson, during his monthly visit, expressed cautious amazement. "The disease appears to have reached a plateau," he said after examining her. "I won't call it remission, that would be irresponsible, but you're certainly doing better than I anticipated when you first arrived." "The mountain air," Zelda suggested. "You said it might help." "Perhaps," the doctor agreed. "But I've seen plenty of consumptives come west seeking a cure, only to decline as rapidly as they would have back east. No, there's something more at work here." His kind eyes crinkled. "A reason to fight, I suspect." Hank, who had been listening silently from the doorway, stepped forward. "Whatever the reason, we're grateful for every day." Dr. Wilson nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. Live each day fully, but continue the treatments. The powders for the cough, plenty of rest, good nutrition." He packed his bag and prepared to leave. "I'll return next month, but send for me sooner if there's any change." After the doctor departed, Zelda found Hank in the garden, methodically weeding between rows of young vegetables. She watched him for a moment, struck by how natural he looked among the growing things, this man who had once seemed as wild and untamed as the land he worked. "Dr. Wilson thinks I'm doing well," she said, joining him in the dirt. Hank glanced up, shading his eyes against the sun. "Notice that myself. Your cough's less frequent. You're not as tired by evening." "I don't want to hope too much," Zelda cautioned. "Consumption has a way of seeming to improve before it worsens, I know." Hank sat back on his heels. "My mother had periods where she seemed almost well again, but I think the doctor's right, you're fighting this harder than most." Zelda plucked a weed from between the carrot seedlings. "I have more to live for than I did in Richmond," she admitted. "There, I was merely waiting to die. Here." She gestured at the garden, the ranch at him. "Here, I'm living." Hank's weathered hand covered hers in the soil. "You've brought life to this place, Zelda, to me." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Been thinking maybe we should plan for a future, just in case." "What kind of plans?" Zelda asked, a flutter of both hope and fear in her chest. "Was thinking maybe we could add onto the cabin, another room or two." His eyes held her steadily. "Maybe a nursery someday." The implication stole Zelda's breath. "Hank, you know I may never." "The doctors in Richmond said having children would likely be impossible with my condition, and even if I could conceive, the strain might." "I know what doctors say," Hank interrupted gently. "Also know they've been wrong before. Not saying we should try right away, just thinking about possibilities." He squeezed her hand. "Unless the idea doesn't appeal to you." "It's not that," Zelda assured him quickly. "I've always wanted children. I just never thought it would be possible after my diagnosis." She bit her lip, considering. "But you're right, we should plan as if we have a future, even if it's uncertain." That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, sketching possible additions to the cabin. Hank, it turned out, had a good eye for construction, having built the original structure himself. "Could add a proper sitting room here," he said, pointing to the south side of the house. "And maybe another bedroom beside it. Would catch the morning sun." Zelda nodded, adding her own suggestions about windows and a covered porch where she could sit during summer rainstorms. The activity felt both practical and deeply symbolic, a declaration of faith in a future they couldn't guarantee, but chose to believe in anyway. As spring shifted toward summer, Zelda's Aunt Elizabeth arrived from Richmond, bringing trunks filled with items from Zelda's previous life. Books, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, winter clothing she had left behind, and several bolts of fabric for new dresses. Elizabeth Jameson was a tall, spare woman with Zelda's green eyes and a no-nonsense manner that belied her gentle heart. Her initial meeting with Hank was slightly stiff, both sizing each other up with careful politeness. By the second day, however, they had found common ground in their shared concern for Zelda's welfare and their mutual love of practical jokes. "He's not at all what I expected," Elizabeth confided to Zelda as they shelled peas on the porch one afternoon. "When you wrote that you'd married a cattle rancher in Colorado, I imagined some rough, uncouth character who'd taken advantage of your situation." "Hank would never take advantage," Zelda replied, dropping peas into a bowl. "He's the most honorable man I've ever known." Elizabeth studied her niece's face. "You love him," she observed, echoing Martha Calloway's words from months earlier. "Very much," Zelda admitted. "It surprised me too, and your health. Your letters have been optimistic, but I need to see for myself." Zelda met her aunt's concerned gaze directly. "I still have consumption, Aunt Lizzie. That hasn't changed, but I'm stronger than I was in Richmond. Dr. Wilson says the disease seems to have stabilized, at least for now." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "When you left, I truly thought I was saying goodbye forever, to see you now with color in your cheeks and light in your eyes." She reached across to squeeze Zelda's hand. "It's more than I dared hope for." "I don't fool myself," Zelda said softly. "I know this reprieve may be temporary. But Hank and I have decided to live as if we have a future, for however long that may be." Elizabeth nodded approvingly. "A wise approach, and I can see he makes you happy, which is all I've ever wanted for you." "He does," Zelda confirmed, "in ways I never expected." The 3 weeks of Elizabeth's visit passed quickly. She helped Zelda sew new curtains for the cabin and assisted with the expanded garden, which now included tomatoes, beans, squash, and a variety of herbs. She accompanied them to church in Ordway and charmed the local women with her Richmond manners and genuine interest in their lives. Most importantly, she witnessed firsthand the loving relationship that had developed between Zelda and Hank, the gentle touches, the shared glances, the deep respect underlying their every interaction. When the time came for Elizabeth to return east, the farewell was emotional but not devastating. "I'll come again next summer," she promised, embracing Zelda tightly. "And you must write regularly. I want to know everything about your life here." "I will," Zelda assured her. "And perhaps someday, when I'm even stronger, Hank and I might visit Richmond." Elizabeth turned to Hank, who stood respectfully nearby. "Take care of her," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "With my life," he replied simply. After Elizabeth's departure, life on the ranch settled into a pleasant summer routine. Mornings were devoted to chores, tending the garden, caring for the small flock of chickens Hank had acquired at Zelda's request, preserving fruits and vegetables for the winter ahead. Afternoons, when the heat peaked, Zelda would rest indoors, reading aloud to Hank or teaching him more advanced writing skills. Evenings were spent on the porch, watching the spectacular sunsets paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Work on the cabin addition began in July. Hank hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy lifting, but much of the construction he did himself, working in the cool early mornings and late evenings to avoid the midday heat. Zelda involved herself in every aspect of the planning, from the placement of windows to the type of wood used for the flooring. "Never thought I'd see Hank Newman taking decorating advice," joked Thomas Calloway, Martha's husband, when he stopped by to help raise a wall beam. "Smart man knows when to listen to his wife," Hank replied good-naturedly. Wiping sweat from his brow, by early August, the addition was nearly complete, a spacious sitting room with large windows, and a smaller adjoining room that could serve as either a guest bedroom or, someday perhaps, a nursery. Zelda had sewn cushions for the window seats and braided a large rug for the floor, while Hank had crafted a rocking chair as a surprise for her birthday. Their first evening in the new sitting room, Zelda sat in her rocking chair while Hank stretched out on the floor at her feet, his head resting against her knees. Outside, a summer thunderstorm rolled across the valley, lightning illuminating the mountains in brief, spectacular flashes. "Happy?" Hank asked, glancing up at her. Zelda's fingers combed gently through his hair. "Completely," she replied. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "A year ago, I was alone in that kitchen, writing to a stranger back east, asking her to take a chance on a life with me. And I was sitting in my aunt's parlor, believing I had months to live and nothing to look forward to," Zelda added softly. "Now look at us," Hank said, gesturing around the comfortable room. "Building a home, making plans." "Living," Zelda agreed. The word hung between them, weighted with significance. For despite the shadow that still loomed over them, the knowledge that consumption was an unpredictable and usually fatal disease, they had indeed found a way to truly live together, embracing each day as the gift it was. As autumn once again painted the Colorado landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Zelda celebrated a milestone she had once thought impossible: a full year since her arrival in Ordway. The anniversary of her stepping off the train was marked with a small gathering at the ranch. The Callaways, Dr. Wilson and his wife, Reverend Taylor, and a few other neighbors who had become friends over the months. Martha Callaway brought a cake, decorated with wildflowers, and everyone raised glasses of cider in a toast to the occasion. Zelda, wearing a new dress she had made from fabric Elizabeth had brought, found herself overwhelmed by the genuine affection of these people who had welcomed her into their community. "If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be celebrating this day," she said when it was her turn to speak, "I wouldn't have believed them. Thank you all for making this place feel like home." She turned to Hank, who stood beside her, his hand warm at the small of her back. "And thank you, my love, for taking a chance on a stranger with consumption." Later that night, after their guests had departed and they were preparing for bed, Hank presented Zelda with a small wooden box he had carved himself. "Anniversary gift," he explained as she opened it to reveal a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Open it." Inside, Hank had somehow managed to place a tiny photograph of the two of them, taken in Ordway by a traveling photographer the previous month. On the opposite side was engraved a simple message: "For all our days." "It's beautiful," Zelda whispered, tears pricking her eyes as Hank fastened the chain around her neck. "Had it made in Denver," he admitted. "Martha's son took it on the train for me." "I love it," Zelda said, touching the locket where it rested against her skin. "And I love you, Hank Newman." "Good thing," he replied with a smile, "since you're stuck with me." As they lay together in the darkness, Zelda reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this place and this man. When she had boarded that train in Richmond, weak with illness and heavy with despair, she could never have imagined the life awaiting her in Colorado, not just a reprieve from death, but a genuine rebirth into a life worth living. Dr. Wilson still cautioned her against excessive optimism. Consumption was consumption, he reminded her gently during his examinations. But even he had to admit that her case was unusual. The disease seemed to have reached a stalemate in her body, neither advancing nor retreating, but allowing her a quality of life few victims of the White Plague ever experienced. "Perhaps it's the altitude," he had suggested during his last visit. "Or perhaps it's love." Medical science has yet to fully understand the connection between the mind and the body's ability to fight disease. Whatever the reason, Zelda embraced each day with gratitude. She continued to have episodes of weakness and coughing, particularly when she overexerted herself or when the weather changed suddenly. But between these episodes were long stretches of relative normalcy days when the illness receded into the background of her consciousness, allowing her to focus on living rather than dying. Winter returned to the high country, but this year Zelda faced it with confidence rather than trepidation. The cabin, with its new addition, was snug and warm. The root cellar was filled with preserved vegetables and fruits from their garden. Hank had slaughtered a steer and smoked much of the meat, ensuring they would have protein through the coldest months. More importantly, they had each other no longer strangers bound by an unusual arrangement, but true partners who had chosen each other, despite the obstacles. Their love had deepened through the seasons, strengthened by shared challenges and simple daily moments of connection. As snow fell outside their window, Zelda sat at the table, penning a letter to her Aunt Elizabeth. She described the Christmas preparations, the progress of Hank's reading lessons. He was now working his way through David Copperfield, and the plans they were making for spring planting. "I cannot say what the future holds," she wrote, her pen moving steadily across the paper. "The shadow of my illness remains, but Dr. Wilson tells me that some consumption patients live for many years in this suspended state, neither fully well nor critically ill. I choose to believe I may be one of them. Hank and I speak now of when rather than if when spring comes, when we add the porch I've been wanting, when we might start a family." She paused, considering this last point. They had begun discussions about children, cautiously at first, then with growing hope as her health stabilized. Dr. Wilson had warned of the risks, but acknowledged that pregnancy was not impossible in her condition. "Nature finds a way," he had said with a shrug. "And you're stronger than many women without consumption." Zelda returned to her letter. "I never expected to find love when I stepped off that train a year ago, Aunt Lizzie. I was simply looking for a place to die with dignity. Instead, I found a place to live with purpose. Hank has given me that greatest of gifts, not just his name or his protection, but his heart, freely and without reservation, despite knowing the challenges ahead. Whatever time we have together, whether it be months or years or decades, I count myself blessed beyond measure." She signed the letter with her married name, still feeling a small thrill at writing Zelda Newman. As she sealed the envelope, Hank entered from outside, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of pine with him. He had been cutting firewood, and his cheeks were ruddy from exertion. "Letter to your aunt?" he asked, removing his heavy coat and hanging it by the door. Zelda nodded. "Telling her about our Christmas plans and the spring garden." "Tell her she's welcome anytime," Hank said, warming his hands at the stove. "Enjoyed having her here last summer." "I did," Zelda replied, rising to pour him a cup of coffee. "She asked in her last letter if we might visit Richmond someday." "Would you like that?" Hank asked, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. Zelda considered the question. "Perhaps when I'm stronger, but this is home now." She gestured around the cabin they had built together, both physically and emotionally. "I can't imagine being anywhere else." Hank's free arm circled her waist, drawing her against his side. "Nor can I imagine this place without you in it." The simple statement contained volumes acknowledgement of the uncertain future they faced, affirmation of the life they had built despite that uncertainty, and the deep love that had grown between a dying woman and the cowboy who had promised to love her for whatever time remained. As snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the Colorado landscape in pristine white, Zelda leaned into her husband's embrace. savoring the warmth of the moment and the promise of days to come. The future remained unwritten, but they would face it together, one day at a time, finding joy in each sunrise and peace in each shared sunset. For in the end, that was all anyone could ask of life, not certainty, but companionship, not guarantees, but love freely given and gratefully received. And in that, Zelda Newman, once a mail-order bride with consumption, had found a richness she had never dared to dream possible when she had first stepped off that train into the arms of the man who would become not just her husband, but her reason to live.